Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of The Rookie and the Vet, a series all about what the healing cycle does, how important hospice care is to residents in Ontario, and providing you with education around the importance of hospice and palliative care. My name is Mallory McGrath, a.k.a. The Rookie, and I am a part of the millennial generation, those born between 1981 and 1996.
Hi, I'm Kassies. I'm chair of the Healing Cycle Foundation, and I'm the vet. I'm part of the boomer generation, which actually goes back to 1946 through 1964. So I'm not going to tell you where I fit in on that, but I'm the vet.
Now, today we have two guests with us, and I want to start by saying that years ago, I had heard of birth doulas. In fact, I actually used one when I gave birth to my daughter, but I had never heard of end-of-life doulas. And today we are bringing you two of them. I would like to introduce Sarah Farr and Ruth MacKay. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, lovely to be here. Thank you for having us.
So could you both maybe start off by explaining what an end-of-life doula is and how it is you both came to come into this profession?
Okay, well, I think I'll start. So, well, an end-of-life doula is, in essence, it's a non-medical profession. It's trained to care for people at the end of life. So it's providing physical, emotional, and spiritual support to people at end of life, along with their families. Both before, during, and after. Those are sort of the three parts. And like we say, it's sort of the living well, the dying well, and the grieving well. And very similar to that of the birth doula. So very similar sort of profession. I came into this work through the loss of my father about 15 or so years ago. Had nothing to do with this work at all, was in public relations. But at his death, and he died in the UK, I had a very profound experience to the point that it made me question what dying was all about. Without getting too out there for your viewers, I witnessed something that was incredible. I'll just say shaft of light leaving the body. And it made me really curious about what this was all about. It was actually a wonderful experience. So for my own interest and just to understand a little bit more, I looked into it and I found this whole movement, this whole soul midwifery movement in the UK, obviously been around for years. I was, nothing new there. So I pursued that and did some of my training with the leader of that in the UK. And that's how I started my journey in this profession.
Wow. And what about you, Ruth?
Right. Well, I also, and I think a lot of people in this work came from something completely different. So I spent over 30 years in the Ontario Public Service, in policy and project management, policy development. But in the last about 10 years of my professional life, I was a very active hospice volunteer. And it was that work, being a hospice volunteer, the training that I received there, and the power of the connection that I was making with people, and that made me think, wait a minute, this is much more. I'm getting a lot more satisfaction out of this than I am out of my high-powered career. And how can I make a switch in that way to being able to do more of this work? And that's when I went back and got a master's degree in aging and health from Queen's, and kept doing the volunteer work, and then also met Sarah. And between the two of us, we realized that there was much more that could be done. Hospice and palliative care in Ontario, as you both know, has some wonderful, wonderful things going on. But there are still gaps. There are still greater needs than the ability of our system to meet. And so we decided to try and use this emerging role of end-of-life doula to support individuals and families in a different way than we were able to do it as hospice volunteers.
Well, it's really interesting from both of you and how you got into it. the fact that you find a lot of satisfaction out of doing what you do is great, because you've left, pretty good jobs that you had as well. But corporate life sometimes isn't all what it's meant to be. So it's nice to see both of you doing this. So the word doula I'd never heard of actually before, until we had a few emails going back and forth about having you on here. And so I did a little bit of research, and there's the birth doulas, there's the end of life doulas, but you're obviously at the end of life doulas. But how does that tie into the hospices? Because you had said you were volunteering at a hospice, but how does that really tie into the hospice community?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we try to do as end of life doulas is similar to with in terms of journeying with individuals and families at the end of their life, is very similar to what we do as resident care volunteers in the residential hospice, or in some cases we are both in-home hospice volunteers as well. The difference, I think, is that we are able to, in our roles as through our own services, we're able to partner with individuals and their families and take the whole journey with them, often from the point of diagnosis, and do some of the things that when we've been volunteers in hospice, we've heard families say, if only we had had some of these conversations earlier, if only we had known what some of our options were, if only we thought about what we wanted the environment to be like, as our person is dying. And that's the thing that's a bit different about it, that instead of going in for a shift, 1 or 2 shifts a week, we're able to, our focus is that individual family, and being with them through the whole time, helping them plan, helping them experience, and then being with them after. So it's a relationship that continues.
Yeah, and how long after does it continue for?
Yeah, well, Sarah?
Long time, because
Yeah.
you develop relationships. I mean, there's always the boundary you have to be. We value being professional as possible. We're part of a number of associations, and we always work very closely with medical teams, respecting boundaries. But our typical relationship with people go on as long as they want. It's all back to the person and the family. So one key difference is that often when we've journeyed with somebody and they lose, the person dies, we've been part of that inner circle, and been honored and privileged to be part of that. How we support with the grieving part is that we have that continuity. We're a known person, we knew that person. So as they're going through grieving and bereavement, we know that person, so we can articulate and put the supports around the person that's left, which I think is sometimes a little different than, of course, if it gets to a point where we need to outsource for various types of grief, we would do that to a trained professional. But often it's just knowing that person and how supporting them in their new life, their new world, their new reality. So there's some quite comfort. So it can go for years, but it depends. We never cut our ties, but we're there respectfully in the capacity that they want us to be.
That's really beautiful, the way you described that. I really liked that.
We check in on all sort of anniversaries and things like that. But we also just, because I think probably both of you know that this is something our society doesn't do very well, is that piece that's that continuing, being literate enough in supporting somebody who has experienced a loss, and how to just acknowledge and be there for the person. We find that actually the dying person gets great comfort also from knowing that we will continue a relationship with their family afterwards.
Someone who's like a third party, someone outside who doesn't have such a direct emotional tie. Obviously, you develop an emotional relationship with
Mhm.
these families, but it's not that direct, lifelong one, right? And
Correct.
so
Right.
knowing that there's someone who's experienced that journey with the family in this supportive role must be so comforting to the dying party, definitely.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm. So you
Mhm.
answered a part of my next question, but maybe
Sorry.
you could get a little bit more specific about the types of services you offer, whether that be right at diagnosis, during the more actively dying phase for the dying person, or after, just so people have a bit of an idea of when they say, oh, well, do I need an end of life doula? What sort of services do you provide?
Mhm.
Do you want me to go?
Sure.
Shall I start with,
Yeah.
well, we sort of categorize our services into 3 sections. We have living well, so that would be incorporate advanced care planning, system navigation, what services you can access for you and your family. Symptom and pain management, we touched a little bit about that. We're not medical, but we do have a little bit of an idea, or it can at least guide people to where they, or what they need to be asking, or just inquire, advocate obviously for that person and for the family. And then our next section is sort of dying well, and that's the sort of journeying with that person when they're actively dying, which can be for months or weeks or days. It depends when we're brought in. And that is, vigiling, accompanying being there for that person, support to the caregiver, which is huge. Equally as important, we make sure both are supported, and that's the advantage we have in a partnership. We both go into every one of our families, and typically what we can do is one can be with the person that's dying, and the other person can be with a caregiver, or overlap, whatever's needed. There's nobody that's going to be left out of this journey. So I think that's a very important part, and we know our clients love that. And then the last part is the grieving well. So that's the support afterwards. And that can be even just simple things like, okay, this is a new world, a new reality for somebody. Their life has changed forever. So who's going to put the garbage out? It can be the practical things. We often get into the emotional, but for someone whose life has changed forever, how do they even get up in the morning, and what is that routine going to look like? So sometimes that can be the slow, gradual stepping into this new world, and we really support that. So if it needs us to be there to put the garbage out, that's what we'll do. So those are the sort of the 3. Did I miss anything, Ruth?
No, I mean, it's interesting. We do, in some ideal world, we would work with people through all of those stages, because then you are developing the relationship. But we've also done, we also have done, for example, we've done just wishes documents. We have a sort of series of questions about people's wishes and preferences at end of life. We've done that with perfectly healthy individuals who just understand that this is something that they should be thinking about. And we've also more often come in at a point of diagnosis, and then worked essentially through all of those stages. And then sometimes we've come in just in the last days or weeks to help create an environment and surroundings, which hospice of course does very well as well, for the individual and their family to know that those last days will be the best they can be. And I did just want to add, because I think this is important, that if you are somebody in Ontario who's fortunate enough to be in a residential hospice or get those hospice support services, that is wonderful. We've worked with individuals in long-term care, in other settings where this is not their expertise. It seems perhaps surprising, and I think it is getting better. But long-term care homes, where 100% of the people who are admitted there are going to, that is their home when they will die, do not always have a lot of the expertise and training in palliative and end-of-life care, or grief and bereavement. Yes. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the people who work in those settings, they have their job, they have their thing that they're supposed to be doing. And yes, they are an emotional support to an extent, but that there needs to be someone whose sole job it is to come in, be that best friend, right? Be that emotional support. And for people in long-term care, not all, but a lot of them are there and don't have a lot of friends their age alive anymore, right? They've reached a certain age, right? My grandparents joke about that all the time. They're at a funeral once every 10 days. It's just that time of life. I joke about everyone around me having babies. They joke about everyone around them dying, right? It's just that phase. So I could see how it would be so beneficial to, you hear the term end of life doula, but it isn't necessarily just about the active period of your life ending, right? It's so much more about a phase of life as well. Yeah.
Yeah. As I said earlier, I did a little bit of research into the term doulas, and I came across a couple terms. There's the death doulas, and then there's the soul midwives I've seen as well too, which I think actually has a nicer ring to it. But could you tell us what the differences are between the two, or is there a difference?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Well, I can, because I sort of shoulder a few of them. I trained and qualified as a soul midwife, I think it was in 2015. So it seems it's not a while ago, but it is in the end of life doula field. And soul midwife is sort of taking the essence of what it used to be in the community. A person would just be that person and would journey, and it's the journeying of the soul. So it gets right into the sort of holistic part of it. So it's really into how we support that soul before, during, and after, and the continuation of that. So that's sort of the UK based, and it's called a soul midwife, which I really love the name too, Ron, but unfortunately we can't use that name here. Because I think some of the pioneers here in Canada who did call it death midwifery, but that's a federally licensed name, the midwifery, so it cannot be used. So that's where it came up. And I think death doula is probably more prominent, would you say, Ruth, in the US? And I think, Canada being the lovely nation that it is sort of shouldering too. So it tends to do the end of life doula sounds a little softer, I think.
Yes.
And I guess it just depends what culturally you gravitate towards, but they sort of all incorporate the same practice and the same scope.
Right. And I mean, I'm not sure if you were going to ask about this, but even in the last, as Sarah says, 5 years, we've seen quite a proliferation of, training for end-of-life doulas and different kinds of certification. It is not in any country a nationally or provincially regulated profession. So in some countries, the US and in Canada now and in the UK, they're trying to come together to develop core competencies and some consistency in the training and competencies that any individual who says, I am a whatever the term is, must have be able to demonstrate. So so it is a sort of emerging field in that way.
Yeah, that would be so important. I don't know, for birth doulas, are they regulated? I'm trying to remember.
No, they're not regulated in Canada in terms of licensing.
No.
They're similar to what we're doing in terms of there are various trainings that you can do, and some are more well-known and than others. There are a couple of states in the United States where birth doulas are licensed, and therefore, and this is the big difference, of course, can be reimbursed through insurance.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, I understand that it's not a direct medical role in either the birth or end of life situation, but you're dealing with heavy stuff in both situations. I mean, I had a birth doula who happened to be a friend, actually, who also happened in a past life to be a labor and delivery nurse. So she knew what she was doing. But that was not her capacity in that space, right? And I mean, she was invaluable, because as the parents, you're lost. You're just trying to get through that process. And you kind of need that third party whose sole job it is to be your mental voice, almost in a way, right? And help you figure things out. And I could see how that's entirely applicable in the end of life sphere as well. You've got the, if say it's a spouse, right? Those two people are in this little journey together, and to be articulate as to what they want, to absorb what medical professionals are saying, that's a lot. Having that third or fourth in this situation person there to absorb that as well, to talk through the process of what's being explained is so invaluable, and I agree, it should be a regulated field to make sure that it is wonderful people who are highly educated like you two, help providing this service. So hopefully that's something Canada keeps ticking along with, right?
Yeah. It's also a fine line. I just want to say, just on behalf of end of life doulas, there is also this sort of balancing act, because there's a lot of people who, especially the pioneers in this field, who believe it should always be community based. They do not want to be regulated. They do not want to be told what they can and can't do, not to be defined, just as in they have a more they want to be able to use like frankincense oil, or if you once you're regulated, lots of things come into play.
That makes
However,
sense, yeah.
I think and I think Ruth and I should speak for Ruth, we want to be able to reach as many people as possible. So it is a bit of a juggling act, but I just want to honor that, because some of the people in the field, especially in Canada, do want to keep it just like teaching in the community and empowering people within the community to do this work. So there is a little bit of a juggling act going on.
That makes sense. It does. I mean, we've definitely seen with other, shall we say, more holistic professions that then became regulated, that you almost lost service. I sometimes see that with naturopaths, right? They used to be, now they're regulated at a different level, and they can do things that are very helpful, but you've also seen some things be removed because of the controls that the government now has on their profession. Absolutely. So I do get your point. I think it's a very good point. Yeah. Do you think that you guys could dive in a little bit more into, you were calling it the grieving well process? So the person has passed on, there is a family who you've developed a close relationship with. We could make up a family and say that there's a spouse and 3 kids left behind, right? So what if they wanted you there, if they said, yes, we need this support, what sort of active support would you be providing to the family?
Well, often it starts right at the point of the death, right? So that it's finding ways that reflect who that person was and what their family dynamic is to immediately take time, take that breath, take as much time as you want to honor what has happened, to spend time. We often do specific little rituals, immediately after death that support the family in starting that process. So something as simple as lighting a candle, doing a reading, sometimes guiding the family members if they wish to, if they want to dress or put flowers around, or, there are all sorts of things like that people so often just understandably react in the moment and call the funeral home and, and that's that. But we have found that it's so powerful and so supportive and so important in terms of that beginning of that grieving process, to take the time right then to do some things that honor that moment. So that's the very beginning of it for us. And then Sarah, the things we do.
I think like taking the time, I think people have this thing, and it is a natural reaction, I think we all do, is like Ruth said, call the funeral home. But you know what? There's no pressing time. It depends obviously on the season and where you are and everything, but taking that time, and there is no rush. Let's actually digest what's happening here, because that's a key part in our grieving process, is to acknowledge what has happened, sit with it, be comfortable with it. Well, not comfortable, but acknowledge it, respect it. And so doing these, just taking time and breathing, like nothing has to be done. Nothing has to be done until you want it to be done. But I think it's just guiding people with that, because most people understandably, I did this too. You sort of think, oh, I've got to get it all sorted and it has to, but that's still a person and that's still a soul. And depending on culture, obviously we bring in, depending on people's spirituality and things too, but that body can be left for up to 3 days, right? With the necessary things taking place. So there doesn't need to be a rush. So we just try and get as much as possible. And obviously we're guided by the family and also the person that's died. We often have conversations with them of what that's going to look like and make sure that it's what they want is what the family can also provide. Not every family can, but I think taking that time is a huge part of it. And people have said to us that that was the thing that they remembered and helped, as hard as it is. Of course, it's not easy at all. But it's a one way of starting that journey and fully acknowledging, because often it can be whisked away and then we're like, what has just happened? I have no idea. My mind's so I find that's really important for people. And I think when we do that bit well, it sets up the tone for the rest of the journey.
Right. I'm studying thanatology right now and just did a course specifically on grief and bereavement. I have to finish that essay. It's reminding me. But when I was learning about the many, because there's many, and we all hear about Kubler-Ross, but you don't hear about the many other stages or the way people describe them. And at this point, I'm just throwing all the stages out and I'm like, I don't know, you just go through your own journey. But what you do, what I read a lot of and reading a lot of the case studies provided in our text talked about people feeling like they didn't, like it did just happen so fast, even when the active dying part took weeks, right? But I think it is that idea that you go into, it's just a normal part of our society that someone dies and you call the funeral home, right? Especially in our more specifically in more Christian Jewish societies. I know specifically that gets done very quickly, right? But we can, especially and me coming from a Christian background, we have time. We don't actually have any religious belief to move that along. We could take our time and sit. And I think to myself, if someone I love died, having that moment to actually sit there and acknowledge it and look and let that absorb, let that part of my brain process that, I can see how that would be so beneficial, a week later after a funeral, where you're like, wait, did all of that just happen? Because if a body leaves that quickly, it could just be, oh, we were wrong. Maybe they're okay, right? So I can understand how important that would be, definitely.
And it's being uncomfortable, like being comfortable with the uncomfortable, right? Because we are a death phobic society, but the more we have these moments, and hopefully with these families that we work with, they then pass it on, because that's what they did with their life. They pass it on to them, and we would just become a little bit more acknowledging of what the whole process is, right? So that's what we
exactly. Okay, well, I think that's all we have for today. So thank you both so much. Your passion for this topic really came through, as well as your knowledge. And I know that our listeners will really appreciate hearing from both of you. Ron, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I just want to say again, thanks Ruth and Sarah for joining us today. You have remarkable jobs, and it's nice to see how you help people out in these circumstances. So thanks again for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
I'll just remind all of our viewers that the 2021 registration for the Healing Cycle virtual ride is online. So please head to www.healingcycle.ca, where you can register a team or your organization, or even just register as an individual. In the month of September, for 4 weeks, we're hoping that people can ride 400 kilometers and raise $400 each. So sign up and do your best, and we'll have a lot of fun in September going on a ride. Thanks again, Ron, Ruth, Sarah, and everyone. Have a great rest of their day. Goodbye.
Bye.